Hello, I think we're just waiting for a few folks to log in. Thanks for joining us. All right, so let's see. I'm going to go ahead and get started here because we have a little bit of a packed agenda. We're just waiting for a few information to get to you today. So, all right, without further ado, thank you everyone for joining us today to discuss tax increment finance districts. It's a very exciting topic. This panel is being hosted by the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, which for those of you who don't know, this is the state's comprehensive planning agency. So for context, in 2018, Senator Allen authored SB 961, which instructed the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, or OPR, to prepare a report to the legislature on the effectiveness of tax increment finance tools to produce housing and location efficient places, amongst other questions. So strategic economics was competitively selected to prepare the report, which can be found on the OPR website under the announcement section, and we can throw the link in the chat. This presentation will focus on tax increment finance tools in a general sense, as well as the SB 961 findings, and an in-depth look at the development of the Fresno Enhanced Infrastructure Finance District, which was highlighted as a case study in the report. So just to introduce myself, my name is Helen Campbell. I am a senior planner at OPR, and I was a project manager for the SB 961 reports, and I'll be moderating today's panel. I am joined by my colleague Alyssa Montañez from OPR, who will be assisting us with the technical aspects of today's webinar. I'm also joined by Nadine and Joseph, who I will introduce in a second, but we just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items first. So we plan to answer questions during the last part of today's webinar, but please feel free to type in your question to the Q&A box at any time. We've disabled the chat for this webinar. So you're welcome to upvote questions that other attendees have asked in order to scoot those questions to the top and prioritize them for the panelists to choose from. So we will do our best to answer as many questions as we can, both in a written and live format. We are prepared to unmute the original asker of the question in order to engage in a conversation with the panelists. So the panelists will go ahead and choose which questions will warrant an unmuting and a conversation. So we're going to go ahead and we want to see who's in the audience today, and we have a poll prepared that Alyssa is going to go ahead and show.
Thanks, Helen. I'll go ahead and launch our first poll. I'll give folks a couple seconds just to see who's in the audience. Some of the answers are public and private sector planners, finance and economic development professionals, elected officials and staff, local leaders, fans of tax increment finance district. And then I'll give you guys a couple more seconds to go ahead and answer that. And then I'll share the results after. So it looks like majority of you have answered the poll. We'll go ahead and end it and share the results.
Wow, so we have a few, most of you are from the public and private sector. You guys are planners as well as finance and economic development professionals. We have a few, like a small fan base of tax increment finance districts, and so we hope to boost that, over the course of the webinar. And it's really good to see local leaders as well as elected officials and staff, because as our presenters will let you know, we always need a local leader in order to be able to champion these districts and these tools on the ground. So thanks for being here. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and finally introduce you to the panelists. So Nadine Fogarty is a principal/vice president at Strategic Economics, which is an urban economics firm in Berkeley, California. She leads a wide range of economic studies, providing expertise in market analysis, development feasibility, and public sector financing strategies with a focus on urban infill and transit-oriented development, which is we call TOD. Nadine holds master's degrees in city planning and real estate development from MIT. And she was one of the lead authors of the SB 961 reports. So we also have Mr. Joseph Dieguez, who is a senior vice president with Cosmont Companies, serving public and private sector clients primarily through market and economic analysis and real estate development advisory. So his recent work includes special district financing strategies, market supply and demand analysis, fiscal impact and economic benefit studies, financial feasibility and pro forma evaluation, and property reuse strategies for municipalities, real estate investment and development firms, and multiple Fortune 500 clients. So Mr. Dieguez graduated with a BS in mechanical engineering from MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he was also the senior advisor for the Fresno Enhanced Infrastructure Finance District, which is featured as a case study in the SB 961 reports. So I'll let you take it away, Nadine, and yeah, we'll go ahead and get started.
Okay, bear with me for just a moment here. I have to swap screens. Let's see. Okay, are you guys seeing the right screen? Okay.
You're seeing your screen with your notes.
Oh, okay. Hang on. Comes up differently every single time. Okay. So let's see, I'm going to be giving an overview of the study that Helen described that we worked on in conjunction with OPR. And it was, as Helen mentioned, prepared in accordance with Senate Bill 961, which made a variety of requests, including a study on the effectiveness of tax increment financing tools for increasing housing production, an evaluation of the potential impact of extending the Second Neighborhood Infill Finance and Transit Improvement Act, NIFTY 2, as we'll call it, to areas around bus stops, including segregated bus rapid transit. And so to that end, we prepared 3 separate reports: a TIF case study report, a report on the effectiveness and use of TIF with recommendations, and a report on the potential for bus specifically to serve as anchors for TOD. So all 3 of those reports are available on the OPR website. However, today I'll be focusing on the report on the use of tax increment financing. Our research questions were: how effective have the TIF tools that are currently available in California been in advancing state goals related to housing production and sustainable growth? What are the challenges that are impeding their use? And how might use of TIF tools be expanded to help increase housing production in location efficient areas? The study was guided by a state working group that Helen convened, and that group provided really valuable input about the recommendations that I'll be presenting today. In addition, the study also benefited from interviews with a number of staff and elected officials from jurisdictions with experience considering or implementing TIF districts, as well as state legislative experts and a variety of other experts, including Joseph. So I've organized the presentation around our key findings with a few poll questions interspersed to keep you from nodding off. Our first key finding is that while a variety of new TIF tools have been created, they are generally not well understood and have not been widely used to date. In addition, the laws governing TIF tools continue to change over time, making it challenging for practitioners to understand and keep up with their potential application. As we all know, redevelopment ended in 2012 under the Brown administration, and beginning in 2014, state legislation authorized a variety of new TIF tools. And these are sometimes referred to as redevelopment 2.0, but it's important to recognize that redevelopment agencies had a much broader set of powers and abilities, including the ability to purchase and sell properties and to orchestrate infill development in a more hands-on way. Furthermore, while redevelopment diverted revenues from other taxing entities, the new TIF tools can't divert funds from school districts and can only capture tax increment from other taxing entities with their approval. And so as the timeline shows, the EIFD tool actually existed for a long time, even prior to the end of redevelopment, but was infrequently used until redevelopment was, until after redevelopment was gone. Still infrequently used. EIFDs are the most common type of district, but there are also a variety of newer tools that have been developed to specifically target infill development and affordable housing, including community revitalization and investment authorities, CREAs, affordable housing authorities, neighborhood infill finance and transit districts, NIFTY 1 and NIFTY 2. These are essentially types of EIFDs that target infill and transit served locations and also have an affordable housing requirement. In addition, there are a variety of other types of special districts designed for specific needs in specific locations, including things like the Seaport Infrastructure Financing District legislation, which is used at ports. So here we come to poll question number 2. How many tax increment financing districts have been implemented since the demise of redevelopment in California?
I'll go ahead and give folks a couple seconds to answer that question, and then I'll share the results in the end. Alrighty, it looks like majority have answered. I'll go ahead and end the poll and share the results.
So it looks like most 42% of you were right, that the correct answer is 12. It's although it looked like people were relatively spread out, but 42% of you were right. And this slide shows lists the districts that have been created. The number actually increased even since we finished our report at the end of last year. As I mentioned before, the vast majority are EIFDs and TIF, but TIF has been considered in at least 40 other jurisdictions that we're aware of. And it seems like there might be some gathering momentum, even despite the challenging economic circumstances now, where we might be seeing more coming up soon. So a variety of factors help to support the establishment of a TIF district, although there are no hard and fast rules. The first is a strong real estate market, because TIF relies on development in order to generate revenues. Also an ability to capture a significant share of the property tax, which can be difficult for cities that receive a small share, and I'll talk more about this in a little bit. The ability to leverage other sources of funding. TIF is usually used in combination with other funding and financing sources. In particular, upfront sources are often needed, given that it can take time for the revenue generated through a tax increment financing district to be sufficient to issue a bond. And oftentimes there's a need to pay for upfront improvements that help to unlock the potential for development. Also, fewer property owners. Most types of districts require a series of public hearings at a minimum, and their formation is subject to a majority protest by property owners in many cases. So it can be easier to implement when there are fewer folks to get on board. For the same reason, community support for development is also important. A local champion who can advocate for the district, including making the case to city departments, elected officials, property owners, local residents, other taxing entities, ideally to help join the district. And finally, it's helpful to have a plan that identifies the needed infrastructure improvements and that is planning to enable the development that will help to generate the tax increment. So given our first finding that TIF tools aren't well understood and haven't been widely used, to date. Our first recommendation is to explore ways that the state can assist with educational resources for communities considering implementation of TIF tools. These might include things like an online mapping tool with case studies and details about how TIF has been used in combination with other funding sources, which could help to facilitate peer-to-peer learning among jurisdictions. An online resource that can be used to evaluate the potential viability of TIF tools given the local conditions. This graphic on the slide is from an online tool created by SCAG, which is designed to assist local jurisdictions in screening for the potential for an EIFD or a CREA district. We also found that there could be some need for even just simple materials that describe how TIF tools work, the community benefits that they provide, and their optimal conditions for success for use with property owners, residents, and local officials. And finally, technical assistance for communities who are considering implementation of TIF tools in location-efficient areas and with a focus on affordable housing. So now we're on to key finding number 2, which is that the limited revenue potential of existing TIF tools significantly limits their ability to assist in meeting state housing goals. This map shows the estimated share of the 1% general property tax that's received by cities. Many cities in California receive relatively low shares of the property tax, which makes it somewhat unlikely that they'll be able to utilize TIF tools absent collaboration with other taxing entities. A general rule of thumb states that at least 15% of the 1% tax is required to make it worthwhile in most cases to go ahead with trying to form a district. However, the estimated median share that's received by local jurisdictions in California is 10% and can range from and ranges from as low as 0 in some cases to more than 60%. So this limits the ability of TIF to address affordable housing needs as well as other goals, because obviously when the pie is only so big, if you're trying to do a district, if you don't have the collaboration of other entities, then setting aside a certain amount for affordable housing can be difficult if you also need those revenues to help pay for things like local infrastructure. And it really underscores the need for partnerships, especially with counties, to enable the use of TIF. So poll question number 3 is, of the 58 counties in California, how many do you think are sharing or have entered into agreements to plan to share their 1% local property tax increment with a city EIFD or CREA?
As before, go ahead and launch the poll and allow you a couple seconds to answer it. And then after that, we'll share the results and Nadine will give us the correct answer. Looks like majority of us have answered it. Ending the poll and sharing results.
I think I went backwards there. Okay, so the answer is actually only 2. Most people, 50% of you said 4, which is good and optimistic, and hopefully within the next year or 2, you'll actually be right. However, so far only 2 counties have developed policies that allow them to contribute to TIF districts under certain circumstances. Those counties are LA, Los Angeles, and Orange County. Sorry. Oops, I don't know why my slides are moving around. Okay. So our recommendations, given the limited revenue potential from existing TIF tools, one recommendation is to explore ways that the state can facilitate collaboration between cities and counties and other taxing entities, such as the county EIFD policies that were established in LA County and Orange County. Another recommendation is to explore ways to leverage existing state programs and funding sources to enable use of TIF to promote location efficient development and affordable housing. And so these could include things like targeting planning resources to assist local jurisdictions in conducting planning efforts, exploring ways that state infrastructure grants or loans might help to enable use of TIF tools, particularly in meeting the need for upfront funding sources that could be repaid by TIF, and exploring ways that the state might partner to assist local jurisdictions in leveraging federal resources for planning and technical assistance, or complementing TIF with federal grants or loans. So we're on to key finding number 3, which is that EIFDs are not being used to directly fund affordable housing, and specific TIF tools that have been created to encourage location-efficient development and affordable housing, including NIFTY and CREA districts, are not yet being implemented. Of the existing TIF tools, as I've mentioned a couple times, EIFDs are the most common, but however, they're not required to target location-efficient development, and they're not required to have an affordable housing set aside. NIFTY districts, meanwhile, and CREA are not being implemented. Based on our interviews, what we're hearing is that it's because they're seen as more restrictive and less flexible than EIFDs, in part due to the affordable housing requirement and their geographic requirements. Only a couple of recent districts in San Francisco, and then the most recent one in unincorporated LA County, the West Carson EIFD, are designed to dedicate a share of funds to go directly to affordable housing. Nevertheless, however, what we found is that many of the EIFDs that have been established to date are still in location efficient areas, so they're helping to encourage development in those places. And indirectly, they're benefiting housing production and delivery of affordable housing. So a couple of examples from the case study report. The Laverne EIFD, this is one of the districts that is receiving county increment in LA County. It's really designed to encourage transit-oriented development around a planned light rail station. And the EIFD isn't funding affordable housing directly, but the investment is going to help to deliver affordable housing units because of an inclusionary requirement. Similarly, the EIFD in Sacramento is assisting in funding infrastructure for the new arena, but as an ancillary benefit, it's also going to help to enable other infill development, including affordable housing. One of the ways that the legislation attempted to encourage use of NIFTY was by expanding the allowable revenues to include sales tax that could be captured by the district. However, this hasn't proved to be a major incentive so far, in part because cities rely on sales taxes for other local uses, and also because because sales taxes are more volatile and particularly problematic right now, given the state of retail. So our recommendations in this area include exploring the potential for legislation that would allow the state to contribute revenues to NIFTY or other TIF districts under specific circumstances. And some of the recently proposed legislation actually could help to facilitate this. And exploring whether there are other changes to the laws governing NIFTY that can help to incentivize their use. And then finally, we identified a variety of areas where changes or clarifications to EIFD legislation might help to facilitate their use. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into detail about these very technical aspects of EIFDs, but they're in the report if people are interested. And the good news is that some of them are already being addressed. And that is the end of my presentation. So I will pass it off to Joseph.
All right. Thank you, Nadine, and thanks, Helen and the team for organizing all this and giving me the privilege to present. So I know for the record that I think I was asked to present because we worked on Fresno and Fresno was to be highlighted. But I think the real reason I was asked, because I don't think there's anybody that enjoys talking about these things more than I do. So those of you who know me on the call, I think you know that to be true. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So as I said, I'll start with talking about Fresno as sort of a highlighted EIFD. We're highlighting it because, number one, it's relatively recent, September of last year, but also Central Valley, it's a sort of a bus rapid transit focus, themes that are not as often spoken about in the world of tax increment finance as some of the other themes we hear about, whether it's rail-oriented or coastal, more metropolitan areas. So I'll start talking a little bit about Fresno, and then we will talk about some other things, activities going on statewide related to tax increments. As it pertains to the Fresno EIFD, pretty large district, 4,200 acres, focuses on two sub areas within the city of Fresno, the downtown focus area and the Blackstone bus rapid transit focus area, shown here on the page. By the numbers, as I said, a little over 4,200 acres. We highlight this as sort of the first city-led EIFD in the Central Valley. The County of Madera has already formed two back in 2018, this being the first city-led in the Central Valley. So at 4,200 acres, it's a little under 6% of the citywide total in terms of acreage. The magnitude of potential new development was a big reason as to why this even came to be evaluated for inclusion in a tax increment financing district. Over $2 billion in new development potential within the EIFD focus areas, both downtown and the Blackstone areas within the general plan horizon by 2035, essentially. The key financial terms in Fresno's district were that the city agreed to contribute a third of its share of the 1% general property tax levy for up to 50 years, with a focus on $100 million in present value terms of infrastructure and public amenities. The initial emphasis of which is Blackstone Avenue mobility plan infrastructure, very high emphasis on bus rapid transit, first mile, last mile type multimodal safety and accessibility, roadway improvements, bus shelters, streetscapes, urban greening, lighting, gateway and wayfinding, really promoting the use of bus rapid transit in that community. I'll mention given the large emphasis of planning folks on the call, many of these EIVs, including Fresno, really had a strong linchpin in planning. So aside from the mobility plan, the district includes overlap with Power District specific plan, Fulton Corridor specific plan, Fresno, Chandler Downtown Airport specific plan areas. So a lot of the groundwork for some of the districts in the various jurisdictions we've seen, including Fresno, a common foundation is in planning documentation. And the development projections were largely based on a general plan forecast within the general plan horizon, 2035 in that case. A big reason, well, there are a variety of reasons why the city of Fresno saw a positive ROI, or return on investment, from a community-wide significance point of view. A lot of it was about the infrastructure itself, essential infrastructure, public improvements, but it's also interesting, almost 100% of the areas within this EIFD are disadvantaged community census tract areas based on calivirus screen. There also happens to be almost 100% overlap with opportunity zone census tracts. And I'll come back a little later to talk about how complementary funding like opportunity zones plays a large role in these tools. So aside from those infrastructure focused benefits, a lot of it was also social, quality of life improvements, environmental sustainability. A big emphasis in Fresno on housing as well, 10,000 plus units at various income levels being catalyzed or otherwise supported by the essential infrastructure being installed, at least in part, with EIFD funding. Economically, otherwise, in the tens of thousands of jobs, both on a construction temporary basis, as well as on a permanent ongoing basis from the development itself that would be catalyzed by the infrastructure investment. But we'll repeat this again later, for a lot of our staff and elected officials, a lot of it comes down to dollars on a general fund basis. A big reason why the city of Fresno was willing to go on this EIFD endeavor was a positive net fiscal impact to the city general fund. An investment of tax increment would bring back other fiscal revenues, net of fiscal expenditures on a positive basis to the tune of 10 million in present value dollars. So a lot of it does come down to dollars and cents, aside from other benefits like housing, like jobs, like social and environmental benefits. So we're going to do a couple poll questions. First, true or false, EIFDs must be contiguous. I'll ask Alyssa for some help.
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. We'll give folks a couple seconds to answer true or false, and then we'll share the results, and Joseph will give us the answers.
Still coming in, but it looks like most folks have answered. And it looks like most folks are right. Go ahead and share it, Alyssa. EIFDs do not need to be contiguous. This is viewed as one of the benefits or the flexibility with these tools compared with some other tools like the community revitalization and investment authorities, or even former redevelopment agencies. They do not need to be contiguous. Here's another one. True or false, EIFDs may only fund improvements within the EIFD boundaries. So far, this one looks much more evenly split among the crowd. Okay, I think we can share it. Most folks are right. Again, EIFDs are able to fund improvements outside of the actual district boundary. The sort of guideline laid out in the legislation is that there must be a tangible benefit to the properties within the boundary. An example might be property tax increment generated within the EIFD could fund a water treatment plant that's outside of the boundary, but that serves the properties within the EIFD boundary. That's just one example of how EIFDs can fund improvements outside of the boundary. So we talked about Fresno. We'll talk at a high level about a few others as folks may be interested in. As Nadine covered, 12 established, including 3 IFDs. But as far as the post-RDA and post-IFD districts, we got 9 fully formed in the state and various others in formation process. My boss, Larry Cosmont, likes to say, you've seen one EIFD, you really only have seen one EIFD, or CREA or AHA. These things tend to be very different in terms of infrastructure emphasis, coastal versus inland, rural versus suburban and urban infill. From a planning perspective, perhaps of potential interest to folks in the audience, I mentioned that a lot of these have really a strong linchpin in planning documentation. We have sort of mall reimagination examples, like in Buena Park. We have plenty of TOD station area oriented EIFDs being formed and evaluated, like Laverne, like the West Santa Ana Branch corridor in Los Angeles County. You've got bus rapid transit corridors like in Fresno, as discussed. So you see, specific plan bases. We see master plan communities, like in Madera County, 2 master plan communities in Riverstone and Tesoro that were formed. We see in West Carson, unincorporated Los Angeles County, the Harbor UCLA Medical Center campus master plan as a lot of the basis, along with the TOD specific plan. And so planning does really play a strong role in laying the foundation for many of these districts. Among these, by the way, of note, are a few of these that do involve city and county partnerships. As Nadine mentioned earlier, we were privileged to work in both Placentia and Laverne with those cities being able to partner with the counties. I'll also say SCAG played really a helpful role in the Placentia and Orange County partnership. As I know, we have SCAG folks on the call. They were really instrumental in interagency communication, coordination, and some funding assistance for the actual formation. And so having a regional partner like that can often help. So why are we seeing sort of our perspective on why agencies are authorizing these districts? It varies. I'll mention 2 of the common denominators that show up a lot. Return on investment, probably first and foremost. we're certainly not seeing any of our city or county clients actually authorize these things unless there's a positive return on investment from a fiscal basis, dollars and cents, general fund, net fiscal impact, net of dollar contribution to the EIFD and net of expenditures that are going to be associated with a higher level of development, right? Police, fire, community services, things that services that new residents and employees will need. We're not seeing that any of our clients are approving these things unless there's a positive net fiscal impact on the general fund. Aside from dollar for dollar return on investment, of course, an incredible emphasis on housing production, on job creation, on just finding a way to pay for essential infrastructure improvements, deferred maintenance. So ROI defined a variety of different ways. But number two we have to talk about is the ability to attract additional funds. EIFDs are by no means a panacea. They are not. Tax increment, for example, takes time to generate. If you form a district, you set your base year as that year of formation, and so you don't have immediate revenue right away. So it may take multiple years until there's enough revenue in the EIFD bank account to float a debt issuance to pay for major infrastructure. And part of the benefit of first committing and establishing the district is it becomes sort of a magnet for other public money, OPM. It's how we use it, an ability to attract private sector investment in one sense, because you've demonstrated the long-term commitment to infrastructure with the formation of this district. And you've essentially created at least one way for that private sector entity to be reimbursed for infrastructure installed initially with private sector funding. And the EIFD or CREA or the TIF district can serve as a reimbursement mechanism. These can also be complementary to other forms of districts like Melrose Community Facilities districts or assessment districts that do generate upfront funding. And TIF district could be used as a reimbursement or takeout financing for those sorts of things. And one other that we have to mention are grants and loans from state and federal agencies. A good example is Redondo Beach began formation in partnership with Los Angeles County. And that partnership was a big reason why Redondo Beach was able to secure some Prop 68 open space grant funding in the order of $5 million, because they demonstrated a local commitment of funding, but they did it in a special way. They had a partner with a county, and they had a special purpose entity set up in their EIFD, a mechanism that was only authorized to do two things, infrastructure and affordable housing. So a grant provider would see that as a higher priority versus a standard city or standard county grant application. I'll keep going. I think Nadine covered this, but it's the idea that because the new age of tax increment financing allow automatically a lesser portion of the 1% property tax general levy compared to the former redevelopment agencies, partnerships with other tax entities is of huge benefit to the TIF districts we have today. So city counties as the major taxing entities that are eligible to participate are the main folks that can contribute, and these things work way better with city-county partnerships. It works better because generally there's a higher degree of increment, but also a city-county partnership is also attractive, more attractive for things like grant funding. That last poll question here is probably the hardest one. Which of the following can EIFDs not fund? Planning and design work, infrastructure, operations, homeless services, improvements to address sea level rise, prevent the spread of infectious diseases, prevent wildfires, or D, broadband. Which of the following can EIFDs not fund? All right, I think we can share the results, Alyssa. All right, so this group is a sharp group. The correct answer is where most people, by a small margin, but still most of the people got it right. Infrastructure, operations, and homeless services. So let's spend a minute on here. EIFDs are authorized to fund planning and design work associated with eligible infrastructure. They're specifically authorized to fund improvements to address sea level rise, spread of infectious diseases, prevent wildfires. Broadband is also explicitly mentioned. But why not letter B, infrastructure operations and homeless services? So operations of any kind are explicitly forbidden from being funded in the EIFD statute. And services of any kind, including homeless services, as surprising as it may be, are not eligible to be funded. So it's an important distinction. Certainly the infrastructure such as providing a shelter and the beds for homeless services would be eligible, but the services themselves would not be. Services are not an eligible expenditure. Important for folks to know that. I think this is our last slide, lesson learned and best practice. So there's a lot of overlap here with what Nadine mentioned earlier in the 961 report. So we'll reiterate a couple of these and perhaps add a few others. From a sort of strategic approach, what's been working for some of the cities and counties that have formed these things are focusing, sort of starting on the projects to be funded and working backward from there, not so much starting with, how much gas can we give this tool? And then with all these dollars, what could we do with it? But rather focusing on what's the essential infrastructure or affordable housing projects that need to be funded and figure out from there, working backwards, how many dollars would it need? What's the timing of those dollars? What does that mean in terms of the city commitment? What is of a potential partner county commitment, and over what duration? You're authorized for up to 50 years. Maybe you don't need 50 years. Maybe you do like Placentia and Orange County, where you max it out at 25 years. And you just sort of dedicate what you need. Potential partners. So the ones like Placentia and Laverne that we've worked on that have been able to get city and counties working together, a big part of it was including those partners like a county early on in the process and transparently, being very transparent about what is targeted to be funded, what is the net fiscal impact for both the city and county general funds from participation, and project champion at each level of local government. That kind of goes along with the one above, but both at a staff and elected official level, find out, if there are folks who really grab onto the idea and can run with it and can promote it internally within each level of the organization. The next one, defensively analyze public agency and community return on investment. We've hammered this a lot in this presentation, but to be realistic, but also comprehensive. ROI, fiscally to the general fund, housing-wise at all income levels, job creation on temporary construction, as well as an ongoing permanent basis, as well as social and environmental goals. What is the return on investment? A realistic but-for test is essential. To be honest with everybody, the first time most cities approach a county to potentially participate in one of these districts, it's not exactly a warm reception, given some of the redevelopment era interactions between cities and counties. But what helps those conversations go better if it's not only transparent, but also realistic. What do we look like if we're able to partner together, let's say a city and county, and catalyze this infrastructure? What can actually happen in terms of future development? And let's be realistic about what doesn't happen. What happens if we don't form the district? You can't just say, nothing at all might happen. Make some realistic assumptions. Maybe it happens more slowly at a less intense level of density or development. Or maybe it doesn't happen at all, or just gets delayed a certain number of years. It's very important to be realistic. From a planning perspective, it's very important to incorporate planning that incentivizes the desired land uses, desired density, whether it's TOD or otherwise. It can be upzoning, or it can be sort of the density reserve approach, what we at COSLON call density opportunity reserve or development opportunity reserve, or maybe you don't automatically give out increased zoning potentially to recalcitrant landowners who are just going to increase their asking price, for land and nothing gets developed, but to reserve density with the city or county and only allocate it to projects that actually perform and deliver on some, preset menu of community benefits, whether it's infrastructure investment, affordable housing, contribution to public art can be customized for each community. Last point, I mentioned this before and I'll mention it again. These TIF districts are by no means panacea funding for infrastructure, but they do work extremely well with other funding sources, whether it's grants, CFD, private sector funding, and very importantly, in many communities like Fresno, is opportunity zone private sector investment. When you're able to couple tools like tax increment, which take time to generate funding, and you couple them with a tool like, the opportunity zone federal tax incentive, a tool that works better the earlier the private sector comes in, it's actually quite a good match. The opportunity zone emphasizes or incentivizes the early private sector investment, and you set up a tax increment financing district around it to capture the value of that investment over time, so that the community can redirect a lot of the value created by that investment into local infrastructure and community amenities of benefit to the community. So that's it. We want to reserve some time for questions. Thank you all for your attention, and happy to address questions.
Thank you so much, Joseph and Nadine. We've had an active audience that are typing in a lot of different questions and upvoting things into the window. And since we have only 12 minutes left, I'm going to go ahead and just dive into the audience's questions. So we've had a few upvotes from Emmanuel Asinas, and Alyssa, I think you might want to maybe unmute Emmanuel in case he wants to explain this question. But the question is, have you looked at distributional or equity issues associated with TIF, such as whether it's a regressive or a progressive tax? So if either of you want to take that, please feel free.
Well, I'm happy to start out. I upvoted this because I thought it was an interesting question. I mean, so it's not technically a regressive or a progressive tax because it's not actually a tax. It's a tax increment financing district captures taxes, property taxes that would otherwise be generated within a district and go to other taxing entities. So it's not a new tax on top of existing taxes. It's a redistribution of existing taxes. But I do think this is a really interesting question in light of the fact that the state is thinking about how can we incentivize greater use of TIF. And so there, as I pointed out in my presentation, I had that one slide that showed that there's a variety of different factors that help to facilitate use of TIF. And one of those is places with stronger real estate markets. And then also, so places with stronger real estate markets are more likely to be effective in using TIF. Also places that that just happen through circumstance and history and the long, complicated nature of California property tax distributions tend to get higher distribution. So that's just some places tend to be in a better position to do a district. And so if the state is looking at how can we incentivize greater use of TIF for these purposes, I think it's going to be really important to think about how, and also the same is true for the federal government. If we're trying to incentivize use of TIF, we also want to make sure that we're not just directing by funds to places that happen to be lucky because they have these circumstances, or that happen to be stronger marketplaces and maybe aren't necessarily the ones that would otherwise need other types of grant funds or other types of funding. So I think it's a really important thing to keep in mind and for us all to be thinking about.
All right, Emmanuel, was that helpful? I think Emmanuel, you might be muted.
Yes, certainly. My question really, it's not really a tax. It's more of a tax incentive, right? Mm-hmm. So my question really relates to whether how you look at studies that look at the distributional effect, whether low income and middle income families are more negatively impacted as opposed to, and you mentioned that it is probably on the purview of the state to look at those kind of things, not just from an overall economic efficiency or effectiveness perspective or statewide or countywide, but really look at the distributional impact. Maybe a targeted policy would be more relevant in that scenario. But I'm just, looking at what you're trying to answer based on your research questions.
Yeah,
but that really answers my question, actually. Thank you.
Yeah, it's kind of an indirect. I mean, it's the effects that you're talking about. It's on individual households are kind of indirect and hard to measure. But like I said, I do think it is a really important.
That's right. Thank you.
To be thinking about. as we think about how to encourage additional TIF districts.
Great.
Certainly,
Thanks.
thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to go to the next question from Dilma Galkin. So she asks, what were determined to be the primary benefits for Fresno forming an EIFD versus allocating general fund dollars to the planned infrastructure improvement? So this was upvoted by 3 other folks on the webinar.
Yeah, I guess I'll compare it to 2 types of general fund commitments. One level of general fund commitment could be if the general fund decided, we're going to float a lease revenue bond, and we're automatically going to set aside, X dollars per year as debt service to float a bond of Y dollars and pay for some of these bus rapid transit corridor improvements. I guess one potential benefit of an EIFD versus that approach is that the EIFD is not encumbering any of today's dollars. It's a commitment of future incremental property tax dollars that are not affecting today's, general fund impact. Now, of course, there are downsides to that, whereas lease revenue bonds would create an immediate funding stream. But that's also part of the reason how we crafted what would be funded by the EIF. It's not things that need to be funded immediately, but things that could be either paid for as increment generates over time or be reimbursed from improvements funded by others, like the private sector. The other potential type of general fund allocation is not necessarily immediately floating some bonds, but just saying, without this EIFD, look, we're just going to set aside in our general fund adopted budget X dollars over the next certain number of years that would go towards this improvement or set of improvements. And the issue with that is sort of the certainty of that bet. General fund budgets change as with turnover of elected officials, staff, just priorities that our city and counties face. The EIFD is a completely separate entity, very intentionally, that gets set up apart from the general fund, even has a separate governing entity from just the city council or county board. And it's sort of dedicated, it's in the separate bucket. The general fund can't touch those dollars, very intentionally so. So especially from a private sector perspective, you sort of know that fund's committed. It can't be taken away when a new administration comes in and they decide it's a different set of priorities. No, that EIFD is special purpose. It's already segregated. So those are some of the advantages, primary advantages to address that question.
Thanks, Joe. And then just a follow-up question on Fresno, do you know if how many of the 10,000 plus housing units in Fresno are deed restricted affordable housing? Do you know that number off the top of your head? No?
I don't. I know it's in their general plan. That was our basis, but I don't know it off the top of my head.
Okay, we'll go ahead and go to the next question. Kimberly Clark, are there any examples of EIFDs utilizing non-property tax increment dollars? What are some reasons for looking beyond property tax sources?
I think this is a good question. I'm not aware of any that are using non-property tax revenues. Do you, Joseph? Do you know of any?
I know certain communities like Laverne and LA County are looking at ways to incorporate, for example, Measure M&R local return dollars or proxy local return dollars as it relates to transit infrastructure improvements. A big benefit to that, quite honestly, is many of these need more funding than just property tax increments. And so a big benefit for doing that is to generate more funding capacity than just the property tax basis. But as we sort of mentioning, aside from sort of ongoing recurring fiscal revenues, a lot of these are really business plans that talk about how do we use this tool to attract grant funding, to attract private sector investment, and perhaps just reimburse. So it's not, maybe that's not the direct question, Kimberly, but I'd say many of these are looking at how to use EIFD not on its own as a panacea, but how to attract other funding.
Great. Thank you. All right, so then we're going to go to Ignacio. I do want to get to Tim Stearns, who asked about 5 questions. So let's see. So most counties have very little to gain by participating in a TIF. Why would they then?
It's going to be different. Yeah, it's going to be different for every county. That's really on the city to approach these folks early and find out what would they be interested in. In Laverne, the county not only saw a fiscal return on investment in terms of county general fund dollars, net of their increment and net of their service costs, but they're also incentivizing the use of Metro Transit, Los Angeles County Metro Transit infrastructure. they're incentivizing development on county fairground properties, which is adjacent to that EIFD area, to University of Laverne, which is an educational resource that's more than just a benefit to the city of Laverne, but it's county, it's a regional educational entity. So in Placentia, there was also a transit focus. A lot of it was alleviating congestion on the 91 freeway by getting more people on Metrolink, by having the station along that line, the 91 line in the city of Placentia. So those two just happen to have transit components, but there are others.
Yeah, there's also often an argument to be made that the county will benefit in the long run in terms of the revenues. This is a point you made in your presentation, Joseph, but I think it's about making that pitch. And I think it's fascinating because the circumstances are so different in different places, but that the goals of the counties are different. So I think it's helpful when the counties have a policy that states when they're willing to participate in a district, because they can express, like, for instance, the LA County policy says, we're interested in contributing to EIFDs only under certain conditions, and things that we care about include affordable housing. And so it's nice if those things can work together.
And then Tim asked questions related to the benefit of EIFDs in small rural areas, specifically for populations and areas with less than 5,000 people. He's asking if these can be of benefit to small rural towns. So if any of you could speak to that.
I mean, I don't know, you can look at County of Madera as two examples, two communities in Riverstone and Tesoro Viejo where they were severely deficient in water and sewer infrastructure. They did have development partners that were willing to tax themselves with CFD and pay impact fees, but it wasn't enough. And so if they were needing to put in a certain greater level of investment into water and sewer infrastructure, they wanted a repayment mechanism, and EIFD was a good source in those cases. There's a reimbursement source for water and sewer infrastructure where there really wasn't any. Those are two rural examples. Again, it's going to be highly dependent on a community. If it's a community that's severely infrastructure deficient, or maybe housing deficient, affordable housing deficient, maybe that's of interest. We have been finding that regardless of population, it's really a lot about how you draw the boundary and what's the funding capacity within that boundary. Small communities like one of our clients, City of Buellton, 5,000 people in Santa Barbara County, they receive 32% of the 1% property tax general levy. That's a lot for a city, net of ERAF. So it can work just as well, if not better, in smaller communities. It doesn't tend to be so much population driven as much as what's the funding capacity and what are the infrastructure needs. And those maybe you have other thoughts.
Yeah, I would just add that it's probably not going to work well in a place that's like a small town that isn't experiencing any growth, because the tax increment won't be growing fast enough for it to really generate a lot of revenue. But if it's a place, if it's a small place that is growing, then I think there could be potential.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to be cognizant of time. It is 1 p.m. This webinar was only scheduled for an hour, but we will send the slides out to all of the registered attendees, and Joseph and Nadine's contact information is on there. And so we have a lot of 16 questions left. And so I think you can either contact the attendees, or we can figure out a way to try to address any other outstanding questions that need answering or that are worth answering. Very important to us all. So thank you so much for attending. And just to let you know, if you want to subscribe to other webinars on Wednesdays from OPR, you're welcome to go to our website at opr.ca.gov. We have a bunch of different planning related webinars that usually take place on Wednesday. So but hope to perhaps see you all again on another webinar in the future. And thank you so much to our panelists and to Alyssa for helping out today.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.